Let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle is similar to the other matter cycles that we've seen, to the water cycle, to the carbon cycle, in that the nitrogen in our planet is moved around in a closed loop. There is very little chance for nitrogen to enter our biosphere, very little chance for nitrogen to leave. A lot of the nitrogen is tied up as N2 in the atmosphere, so that's a gas. And the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere as a gas is trapped there more so than water or than carbon in the carbon cycle. And that's because it's harder for living things to access. And it's mainly harder for living things to access because the nitrogen that is existing up here in the atmosphere has got a triple bond between the two nitrogen atoms. And that triple bond is a high energy bond, and it ends up holding the nitrogens very tightly together, and it makes the nitrogen a difficult molecule to break down. So if you're a plant, you need nitrogen. If you're an animal, you need nitrogen. You need nitrogen to build your proteins. Nitrogen is a key ingredient in DNA, so you need nitrogen. It's harder for you to get. In the water cycle, if you're a plant, you can just take water up through your roots, right? You have root uptake where the water that's in rivers and lakes can move right into the plant. You can make use of that water there. If you're an animal, you can just go and find some water and you can drink it. You can put it into your body and get the water that you need. In the carbon cycle, if you're a plant, you can get your carbon through photosynthesis, right? You take carbon out of the atmosphere, you can do photosynthesis and you can turn it into carbohydrates and you can bring it into your plant body. And so it's very easy for plants to access carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if you're an animal, you can eat the plant, you can steal its carbon. If you're a higher level animal, you can eat the lower level animals and you can eat their carbon that way. In the nitrogen cycle, it's not that easy. Plants here can't access the nitrogen from the atmosphere. They can't get at it. They just don't have the cellular machinery to be able to break down this nitrogen molecule and incorporate it into their proteins and DNA in order to be able to use that nitrogen. So what they have to do is to rely on bacteria in the soil. And what the bacteria are able to do is they're called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And those nitrogen-fixing bacteria can take the nitrogen from the air, the N2, and can turn it into, first of all, ammonium. Now, ammonium is going to be a more accessible form of nitrogen. You can see it's an NH4+. It's got a nitrogen in it right here. Now, there are other types of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria that can turn the ammonium into nitrites, NO2-. And then there are nitrifying bacteria that can further turn those nitrites into nitrates. And it's nitrates that the plants want. So we have to rely on these bacteria here to turn the unusable nitrogen, N2, into a usable form, nitrates, NO3-. And then these nitrates are dissolved in the water that plants take up through their roots, and then the plants can use the nitrogen that's part of the nitrates in the roots. So it's much more difficult for the plants to get the nitrogen. If you're an animal, though, it's no harder than carbon. If you're an animal and you want to have some nitrogen, then you can just eat a plant, right? And if you're a higher level animal, you can eat a lower level animal and get the nitrogen that way. Now you can see these processes happening in your garden or in the area around you. So if you have organic material like old food, right? Bits of food and like scraps that you're not eating, you can compost them. And when you compost them, what you're doing is you're setting up a pile or a pit, and you're allowing bacteria in the pit to break down these food scraps and to release the nitrogen back into a usable form. And you can see that here. Those are called decomposers. And what the decomposers do is they can take nitrogen that's already trapped in the organisms bodies, right, in their proteins and their DNA, and they can break that nitrogen back down and turn it back into ammonium. And then bacteria in your compost pile can then turn the ammonium into nitrites and then into nitrates. And so if you allow your compost to sit and you allow it to work, you allow the bacteria to work, then you can produce a rich fertilizer. You can produce compost, which is going to have lots of nitrates, which you can then add to your garden and your plants can use. Right? So your plants can use it, their green grass can grow using that compost. Then the bunny running through your garden can steal the nitrogen by eating the plants. And if somebody comes along, like this wolf, they can eat the bunny and they can get their nitrogen that way. Now, we have figured out as humans, though, that we don't necessarily need to rely on these bacteria to do all of this work for us. And we want to produce lots of food on smaller scales and in a quicker time period. And something that can help us with that is synthetic fertilizer. So what synthetic fertilizer does is it allows you to add usable nitrogen directly to the soil. And fertilizers always have an NPK rating. The N stands for the nitrogen content, the usable nitrogen content of the fertilizer, and the P stands for phosphorus, the K stands for potassium. And phosphorus and potassiums are two other elements that are needed by plants. We haven't talked about them in Science 20, but nitrogen is kind of our one of our main ones. So nitrogen is going to be listed on the package, and this just means that this fertilizer has 10 parts nitrogen for 30 parts phosphorus and 20 parts potassium. And nitrogen is going to be needed, especially in the earlier parts of plants' growth cycles, in order to really build up material, to build proteins and to build its DNA in order to grow. So early in the plant's life cycle, it needs lots of nitrogen, which you can give it by adding the correct amount of fertilizer. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way, and you can produce compost, or you can buy compost and add nitrogen that way. But no matter how you do it, that's why plants need rich soil to grow in. They can't just grow in any kind of dirt. They need rich soil that's got lots of nitrates for them. And if you have a really healthy garden with really, really rich soil, that garden includes living bacteria in the soil that's going to help to break down. It's going to help to break down our organic material that's going in there, like old plant bodies and things like that. And it's going to be replenishing the amount of nitrogen, the amount of nitrates that are present in the soil.